But anyway, so I'm very passionate about some of the issues related to Lyme disease, about the fact that there are a lot of people out there who are falling through the cracks of the medical system because of outdated guidelines, at least in my opinion, and probably a lot of people's opinions, and the need for certainly more research. So one of the areas that I think it has attracted a lot of interest among the Lyme disease community and among some researchers is the possibility that the disease, which historically has been transmitted through ticks, or at least that's the way we think of Lyme disease, as being transmitted through an infected tick bite, whether there are other modes of transmission, sexual transmission, transplacental, so from pregnant mother to fetus, blood transfusions. Certainly there was a report from the Centers for Disease Control probably 2 or 3 years ago about 3 young individuals who died suddenly, and it was found when they were organ donors, and when they were looking at their organs and hearts in particular for organ donation, saw something unusual, followed that up to pathologists, and found that they had evidence of Lyme disease, Lyme carditis, so the Borrelia spirochete had infected their heart. One of those donors actually had some organs transplanted into a recipient, and the other 2, I believe, were not transplanted because of the evidence of Lyme disease. So I would say from that there was some hesitance to take organs from somebody who was infected and transplant it into somebody else for fear that that would be a direct transmission. So I don't know that there's definitive evidence of transmission either sexually or from mother to fetus, or through breastfeeding, or through blood transfusions. But as a scientist, I certainly wouldn't exclude it. I'd like to see more data, but I think it's certainly intriguing that organs were not donated from people who had active infection, so I'm not quite sure why blood transfused from people who are infected. Although, having said that, it's often very difficult to detect Borrelia, which is the bacteria that is responsible for causing Lyme disease. It's often very difficult to detect it in blood. Nonetheless, I think that there certainly are possibilities, and I think the research community should be open to the potential for different possibilities. But as of today, there's really no concrete evidence that the disease can be transmitted sexually or transplacental or through breast milk or from blood transfusions. Some of the other concerns that people have, the incidence of Lyme disease literally seemingly went from a Friday to a Monday over a weekend, from 30,000 a year, which was the quoted Centers for Disease Control incidence per year in the United States, to 300,000. So I don't know that there was a proliferation in the tick population over a weekend, but there was probably more recognition and maybe better diagnostics, or maybe more reporting. I mean, there's a lot of people who think that this disease is underreported. There's a lot of, I think the controversy among different groups, and I'm a cancer researcher, I have to admit that there's a lot of polarization when it comes to Lyme disease that I just haven't seen in oncology. There's an Infectious Disease Society of America, which are sort of the mainstay academic infectious disease society, the group members who hold to one criteria for diagnosing the disease. There are other physicians in the community who treat a lot of Lyme disease, individuals with Lyme disease or presumed Lyme disease, who believe that the Centers for Disease Control and the IDSA, the Infectious Disease Society of America's guidelines for diagnosing, which is based on essentially a 2-tier testing of looking for the immune response in an individual. So first looking for titers of antibody, and then trying to confirm that those antibodies that are detected are directed against the bacterium responsible for Lyme disease, and so there's a second confirmatory test called a Western blot. And there are two components of the Western blot. There's a more acute phase for people who have been recently infected. That's called an IgM antibody response, and there's a convalescent or a longer-term immune response that's called an IgG response. And within each of those, the IDSA and the CDC has established strict criteria for what constitutes Lyme disease. You have to have 2 bands on an IgM, you have to have 5 bands on an IgG, or you could have the telltale classic rash. A lot of people don't have the rash. I never had the rash. I never remember getting bitten by a tick bite. And I think there's this probably misperception that people have to have a rash in order to have this disease. The estimates are that up to 40% of people may not have the rash. Depending upon where you're bitten or what the complexion of your skin is, it may be more difficult to detect a rash. So, so people have questioned this long-term, what I like to call chronic Lyme disease, what others call, post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome. It may be semantics, but there are people who are really suffering. There's no question about it. They're not malingerers. They're not people just looking to be put on disability. I personally have been called by high-profile lawyers who are partners in big firms making, good salaries and living a very nice life, and suddenly hit a wall. They could tell you the exact day that they couldn't function and think anymore and are now on disability. I don't think they wanted to completely change their life around. I know other PhDs and MDs and others who had to quit their jobs and are essentially disabled. So there's, as a physician and as a scientist, I look at this and I think there's clearly something going on with these individuals. Now, whether it's 20% or 40%, and if you add up the numbers, if there's 300,000 new cases a year, and perhaps 20 to 40% of those people don't get better with 4 weeks of oral doxycycline, then that starts to add up. So the exact numbers of chronic Lyme patients, I think it's not clear, but it's not trivial. And the effect of those individuals dropping out of the workforce and consuming healthcare resources is not trivial either if you look at it solely from a medical economic standpoint. And certainly the toll from a personal standpoint on individuals and families just completely destroyed by this disease is tremendous. So I think one of the big questions is what is this disease? Like, why are these people suffering? Do they have active infection that is resistant? And I know there's questions that people are, wanting to know about persisters. So is this just resistant disease that did not respond initially? Is this an autoimmune response? So the actual disease is cleared, but these individuals have an autoimmune effect. It's very similar to, rheumatic fever, where you get a strep infection, and the body sort of not only fights the strep infection, but then turns the immune system against tissue on the valves of the heart. So I don't know, I think the answer requires more research, quite frankly, because right now there's a lot of people who are not being treated and are suffering, and there are other people who may be treated and being overtreated with antibiotics and are suffering as well, probably from the consequences of antibiotic therapy. Look, we know antibiotics affect the gut bacteria, the microbiome, which is one of the hottest areas in cancer research and other areas as well. And the microbiome is not just, Jamie Lee Curtis telling you to eat your Activia and, you'll feel better. The gut microbiome regulates your systemic immune system, regulates your cardiovascular system, essentially regulates your endocrine system. So from your gut, the bacteria regulate all the important activities in your body. And so taking antibiotics is going to indiscriminately destroy, the good and bad bacteria. And taking antibiotics for 2 and 3 years and 4 years, which I've heard some people do, is going to take a toll on the body. On the other hand, someone like myself who was not treated, the damage from the bacteria after years, can have a profound effect. And in my own personal story, led to irreversible heart damage, which eventually led to a heart transplant. So, and there are people who are cognitively impaired, again, who drop out of their jobs and can't function in society anymore. Those are not inconsequential long-term effects from an infection. As a cancer researcher, and I've given talks comparing the biology of Lyme infection and probably other tick-borne illnesses to the biology of cancer. Very similar. So, for me, the concept of persisters is nothing surprising. I mean, in cancer cells figure out ways to evade the immune system, figure out ways to resist chemotherapy, radiation therapy all the time, and we're constantly chasing our tails trying to figure out how to kill resistant tumor cells. It's not surprising that Borrelia bacteria can also figure out ways to evade the immune system, not only the immune system, but antibiotic therapy. If you look at the genome of the Borrelia, at least one of the strains that has been sequenced, there are proteins that are expressed in the bacteria that can lead to antibiotic resistance. Some of those same proteins we find in cancer cells that lead to resistance to chemotherapy. So, I think the notion of persisters, these bacteria that survive, whether it's by changing shape or whether it's by expressing different proteins, should not be surprising and may account for some percentage, either, who knows, 50%, 60%, or 15%, whatever it is, of people who get treated and don't get better, so the chronic Lyme disease patients. And we need to figure out better ways to overcome that resistance. I think that there, again, just to get back to the cancer and Lyme disease analogy, we know now that cancer is not one disease. When people say, the war on cancer, it really means nothing. Cancer is probably thousands of diseases that are distinguishable based on their molecular characteristics. And so with the ability to sequence in the Human Genome Project, we know now that there are at least probably a dozen subtypes of breast cancer. So, to say I've got breast cancer, again, is not all that helpful anymore. And with that, we've realized that you can't treat, so again, I'll take breast cancer for an example, a disease that I've done research on and developed a molecularly targeted therapy for. You can't treat all breast cancer now with, a one-size-fits-all algorithmic treatment approach. I mean, that was done 30 years ago and it didn't work. And so now with the recognition that there are molecular subtypes of cancer, we've identified targets within those subtypes that need to be treated, and the treatment needs to be tailored towards the molecular subtype. So for example, breast cancers that overexpress a certain growth factor receptor called HER2/neu, we've developed 4 targeted therapies against HER2/neu. So when I look at Lyme disease, people say I have Lyme disease, and we know that there are dozens of different strains of Lyme disease. I think that we need to start thinking in terms of the heterogeneity of Lyme disease, that maybe a one-size-fits-all mentality, just like cancer, doesn't fit with Lyme disease. And so saying take 4 weeks of doxycycline and you'll be cured may not be the right approach. And personally, again, as a researcher in a field that I think has eerily similar biological features to Lyme disease, I think we need to take a good hard look and say maybe this is very similar to cancer in the sense that the different strains may have different biological behaviors that need to be treated in a more tailored approach, and again, not use a one-size-fits-all type of mentality. That's going to require research. I think from, a lot of the research that's done in this field, quite frankly, a lot of the very good research is done in veterinary schools. And there's good evidence that, that some of the different strains do behave differently. And frankly, some of the reasons why people end up with Lyme disease primarily in their joints, and some people may have more cardiac manifestations like I did, and some people may have more central nervous system, may not just be bad luck. Again, very similar to cancer, where we used to think that, metastatic behavior, why somebody got a metastatic lesion in the brain and why somebody got metastatic disease in the bone, that it was just bad luck, and now we know that there's biology behind that there's homing receptors and homing mechanisms that tell a tumor to go to the brain, or go to the heart, or go to the lung, or go to the liver, or go to the bone. And very similarly, at least in the animal data, there may be homing mechanisms that predict why some strains of Borrelia may end up in the heart and have a predilection for carditis, and others may end up in the joints. So now people could say, and somebody did say this when I was on the Diane Rehm show, sort of poo-pooed all animal data and said, well, mice and dogs are not humans, and that's true. But if we believe that, then we'd probably throw out 98% of all biomedical research, and most of the cancer breakthroughs that have been made, which were evaluated in animals before humans, we give that no credence, and I just think that's ridiculous. I think we have to have, a healthy degree of skepticism whenever we cure a lot of mice of diseases, but we can't just throw out, all animal data and say that it's not human data. So, so I think we do have to go back and look at some of the very good research in Lyme disease that's been done, in animals, and say that this probably isn't just one disease, and we shouldn't be treating it as such. One of the arguments made about prolonged antibiotic therapy is that there was a randomized study showing that prolonged therapy for people who had chronic symptoms was no better than placebo, chronic therapy with antibiotics. And I guess the answer that I would have is I'm not sure that that was a study that I would take to the bank as the holy grail. Number one, we don't really understand the chronic condition anyway, so we don't know whether everyone who has chronic problems has persistent infection, or again, some may have an autoimmune response. And we don't even know that the antibiotics that were given in that study were the appropriate antibiotics to treat persisters if those chronic symptoms were related to resistant bacteria. So I'm not sure that that's a study that definitively shows that antibiotic therapy does not benefit people. I think it's a study that was probably, in its time, tried to answer a question, but since then, the evidence for persisters and other mechanisms of persistent disease and symptoms has evolved, and that's a study that I don't think should be used to discredit the chronic use of antibiotic therapy. Again, on the flip side, antibiotic therapy, prolonged antibiotic therapy is not a benign, it's not like taking vitamin C every morning. It has effects on the microbiome, and those effects can be pretty significant. And in fact, some of the effects that people experience long-term with Lyme disease, some of those effects, and again, I don't know the percentage, may be contributed by prolonged antibiotic therapy and the effects it may have on the gut microbiome. So, so I think, once again, it's all pointing to the fact that we need a lot more research into this disease before we can, I think, effectively manage individuals the way they need to be treated. So just in closing, just some thoughts. I think we need to bring in people researchers from outside this field. I think breakthroughs will come from people who have tackled very similar issues in other therapeutic areas. You know, in research, and even in clinical medicine, we tend to be very siloed. So the cancer people don't talk to the infectious disease people about the research. Even within cancer, the breast cancer researchers don't necessarily talk to the people doing prostate cancer research and brain tumors. And it's unfortunate, but that's just inherent to the system. I think that what Lyme disease calls for are people from the outside, basic immunologists, cancer researchers who have looked at resistance, who have looked at metastatic homing, again, things that are very similar biologically to what we need, the insights that we need in Lyme disease. And we need just fresh ideas. We need to bring in people, because I think to do population studies with flawed Western blot testing, personally, I don't think is going to advance this field. And I think a lot of people who look at this field from the outside, and I've talked to a lot of immunologists, and I've talked to a lot of very well-respected basic scientists who say, you got to be kidding me. In 2016, we're still relying on a Western blot, using one strain of a bacteria to diagnose a disease. That we're in an era of genomics. You got to be. This is not 2016 science that we're utilizing to tackle this disease. So we have a lot of people looking at this disease from the outside saying we need better diagnostics. I mean, we have people, it's nothing surprising to people with disease and advocates. We need better diagnostics. We need tests that will definitively say, yes, you've got Lyme disease. Here's antibiotics that we need to treat you with. Or no, with a fair degree of certainty, we don't think you have Lyme disease. And therefore, treating you ad nauseum with antibiotics is going to do more harm than good. The other thing too that we forget about are the co-infections. So you could treat the Lyme disease, but if you haven't either looked for the co-infections, we know now that ticks, are pretty dirty. You get a tick bite, you get a whole menu of diseases. So it may not just be Lyme disease, but it may be Bartonella, it may be Babesia, it may be a whole host of things. So we need to have better tests for those other diseases. And so some of the chronic problems may not be related to persistent Lyme disease, but related to persistent other co-infections. The diagnostics need to be improved. And whether that's through molecular diagnostics or whether it's through urine antigen testing that are directly looking for proteins and not looking for immune responses. Whatever it is, we need to advance this field. And again, personally, I think that we may need to be looking at different targets other than just antibiotics. What are the genomics of Borrelia telling us? Are there metabolic targets that we could be going after from a therapeutic standpoint? We've done that with cancer. What about biofilms? Biofilms, again, this whole notion of bacteria microenvironment. The bacteria and the biofilms are essentially sort of their own little microenvironment, very similar again to cancer and the microenvironment that helps feed cancer cells. So it may not just be the bacteria itself, it may be what's around the bacteria that's helping to protect it and helping to promote its growth. And we need to better understand the mechanism of biofilm formation and whether there are therapeutic targets in the biofilms that can help degrade biofilms that's very distinct from antibiotic therapy. So maybe a targeted therapy against the biofilm in combination with antibiotic therapy is much more powerful than just antibiotic therapy alone. I mean, these are all questions that need to be addressed. The bottom line is that we as advocates, and I think it's incumbent that we push for more funding, both from a federal funding, whatever the $20 million a year from the NIH budget that is allocated for Lyme disease research is woefully inadequate for a disease, of 300,000 new cases a year. So there needs to be more funding. I think the funding will require recognition that this is a disease that warrants that type of attention. So if our politicians think that this is a disease that's easily diagnosed and easily treated, then what's the need for funding? I mean, what's the big deal? We've got all the answers we need. So we need to change the perception. Again, it gets back to changing the perception. This is not necessarily a disease that is, easily diagnosed and easily treated. It's a disease that is causing real problems among people who are suffering long term, and therefore we need the money. We need more than $20 million. We just had Vice President Biden came to Duke and is visiting other cancer centers talking about the moonshot, $1 billion that will be allocated to trying to, make not just incremental but transformative breakthroughs in cancer research and cancer treatment. I think we should have the same sort of moonshot for Lyme disease, and we should have the same sort of increased allocation of funding to adequately resource that type of national effort. And it's going to be up to us to convince politicians that this is not just the easiest disease in the world to treat and cure. And so, with that, I'd say, let's re-educate people. Let's try to bring more people into the fold. In the meantime, let's continue to, as advocates and people who have been personally or indirectly touched by this horrendous disease, let's try to, through philanthropy, try to fund the best research we can, and hopefully create the perfect storm with government and private foundations to fund research that will lead to breakthrough and not just incremental advances in the field, and again try to bring people in who are not considered typical Lyme disease research, but I think can bring in fresh ideas, who have tackled issues that we're trying to address in the Lyme disease world, and can really advance this by leaps and bounds. So.